The hum of the airport terminal was a familiar symphony. An indistinct chorus of rolling suitcases, muted conversations, and the steady rhythm of flight announcements over the intercom. Admiral Thomas Bradley moved through the sea of travelers with an easy, unhurried gait. His white button-down shirt and dark jeans blended seamlessly with the crowd, offering no hint of the uniform he typically wore or the rank that commanded respect in military halls. Today, he was just another passenger, carrying a small overnight bag and a first-class ticket he had booked days in advance. For all the prestige his career afforded him, Thomas had long preferred commercial flights when his schedule allowed. It was a choice rooted in a sense of humility and practicality. An opportunity to remain grounded in the world he had sworn to protect. He would sit among the travelers, watch families reunite, and overhear snippets of conversations about everyday lives. These moments offered him a perspective he found essential, far removed from the calculated strategy meetings and high-stakes decisions that defined his days. At the check-in counter, the attendant, a young woman with a polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, hardly glanced at him as he approached. Thomas handed over his ticket with a polite nod, watching as she scanned the barcode and typed briskly on her keyboard. There was nothing unusual in her demeanor, no immediate sign of what was to come. He waited patiently, his gaze drifting to the steady stream of passengers around him. Families herding restless children, business professionals clutching sleek briefcases, and the occasional harried traveler darting past. All pieces of the same unspoken choreography that played out in terminals across the country. "Sir," the attendant said, her voice flat, breaking through his thoughts. She held out his ticket without meeting his eyes. "Your seat has been reassigned. Unfortunately, there's no availability in first class." Thomas blinked, the words registering slowly. He looked at the ticket she handed back, economy class. Group 6. His brow furrowed, not in anger but in quiet confusion. "Reassigned?" he asked, his tone even. "This seat was confirmed days ago. There must be a mistake." The attendant's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her gaze fixed on the screen as if the answer lay somewhere within the glowing lines of code. "No mistake, sir," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "We're fully booked, and your seat has been moved. You can still board with Group 6. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unspoken passing over his face. He wasn't one to make a scene. And a seat was, after all, just a seat. Yet something about the way she avoided his gaze, the clipped efficiency of her tone, hinted at more than mere logistical error. He glanced at the line of passengers checking in beside him. An older couple in tailored travel wear. A group of suited professionals. Their interactions with the staff seemed seamless, accompanied by smiles and courteous nods. No reassigned seats. No clipped tones. "Is there a reason my seat was reassigned?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The attendant's expression didn't waver. "It's an overbooking issue," she said simply. "There's nothing I can do." Thomas stood for a moment, weighing his options. Decades of military service had trained him to pick his battles carefully, to discern when to push forward and when to let things go. But this wasn't about the seat. It was about the principle. The quiet dismissal, the implicit suggestion that he didn't belong in the space he had paid for, pressed against the edges of his composure. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," he said finally. Her fingers paused mid-type. For a brief moment, her polished exterior cracked, a flicker of irritation crossing her face before she nodded curtly and disappeared into the back office. Thomas exhaled slowly, folding his arms as he waited. Around him, the rhythm of the terminal continued unabated. Yet he felt the faint weight of eyes turning toward him. Curious glances, subtle but unmistakable. He had felt them before. In airports, restaurants, even the quiet corners of boardrooms. The lingering scrutiny, not for what he was, but for what others assumed him to be. When the supervisor arrived, his smile was practiced, his demeanor polished, but Thomas could sense the undercurrent of avoidance. The man's words were perfunctory, apologetic in form but empty in substance. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience," he said after a brief exchange with the attendant. "Your seat was overbooked, and unfortunately, there's no availability in first class at this time." Thomas listened, his expression unreadable. He had heard similar justifications before. Explanations that smoothed over discomfort without addressing its root. He straightened his posture slightly, his quiet presence growing heavier. It seems other passengers are being seated in first class without issue, he said, his tone measured. Is this standard procedure? The supervisor hesitated, his smile faltering for the briefest of moments. Sir, I assure you this is just an unfortunate coincidence. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the man's face, the nervous flicker in his eyes. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice calm but unyielding. I'd like to speak with the pilot. The request hung in the air, carrying with it the weight of unspoken authority. The supervisor's composure cracked further, a subtle shift in his posture betraying his discomfort. That won't be necessary, sir, he began, but Thomas interrupted, his tone firm now. I insist. It wasn't anger that fueled his insistence, but a deeper sense of purpose, a reminder, not just to the staff but to himself, that some battles were worth fighting. As the supervisor disappeared again, Thomas stood silently, his presence steady against the currents of judgment and indifference that swirled around him. This was not a battle for a seat. It was, as always, a battle for respect. The supervisor's exit left Admiral Thomas Bradley standing alone at the counter, his hands resting lightly on the edge, his face impassive. Around him, the airport moved as it always did, with the efficient chaos of travelers and staff converging in 100 different directions. Yet for Thomas, the space felt still, time slowing to match the rhythm of his steady breaths. He had learned to hold his emotions in check, not through indifference but through necessity. Decades of service had taught him that anger, no matter how justified, rarely led to resolution. What lingered now wasn't anger but a quiet sense of inevitability. This wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of subtle dismissal. It had come before in many forms. A glance too brief, a tone too sharp, a question too pointed. It was a part of life for him, as familiar as the polished boots and crisp salutes of his career. The minutes stretched on, and Thomas felt the weight of eyes on him again. He glanced around without moving his head, noting the way people's gazes lingered just long enough to suggest curiosity, though not long enough to suggest concern. They didn't see him as Admiral Thomas Bradley, the man who had commanded ships and shaped strategies that protected the nation. They saw only what they expected: a middle-aged black man, casually dressed, perhaps out of place in their carefully constructed assumptions about who belonged in spaces like first class. When the supervisor returned, his carefully constructed smile was back in place, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Sir, we appreciate your patience, he said, his tone professional but detached. Unfortunately, we're unable to accommodate you in first class for this flight. I truly apologize for the inconvenience. Thomas met the man's gaze evenly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and deliberate, every word carefully chosen. I understand the challenges of overbooking, but what I don't understand is why my seat was reassigned while others remain seated in first class without issue. The supervisor hesitated, his practiced demeanor faltering under the weight of the question. It's standard policy to accommodate passengers as best we can, he offered, the explanation falling flat. Standard policy. Those words lingered in the air, heavy with the burden of unspoken truths. It wasn't a policy written in the airline's manual, but one that played out in countless subtle ways, shaping decisions and interactions without ever being named. Thomas could feel it in the way the supervisor's voice tightened, in the faint sheen of nervousness on his brow. I'd like to speak with the pilot, Thomas said again, his tone unwavering. The supervisor's smile faltered further, replaced by a thin veneer of politeness. Sir, there's no need to involve the pilot. I assure you, we're doing everything we can to resolve this matter. Thomas held the man's gaze, letting the silence stretch between them. When he spoke, his words carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life navigating storms far more treacherous than this. I insist. The words landed with finality, leaving no room for negotiation. The supervisor nodded once, tightly, before retreating again. As Thomas waited, his thoughts drifted. He had always believed in the value of patience. in allowing others the opportunity to do what was right. But patience, he knew, was often mistaken for passivity. And in moments like this, patience felt like a heavy coat he was forced to wear, its weight a reminder of battles fought in silence. He shifted his attention to the line beside him, watching as passengers moved through with ease. A young woman in a sleek black suit handed over her ticket, receiving a warm smile from the attendant. An older couple in matching travel jackets exchanged pleasantries with another staff member. The contrast was stark, almost absurd in its clarity. It wasn't about the seat. Thomas knew that. It was about the subtle calculus of assumptions. About the way a person's worth was weighed and measured without their consent. In the military, he had risen through ranks that demanded discipline and excellence. Respect there wasn't guaranteed, but it was earned, and once earned, it was given freely. Out here, in the civilian world, respect seemed conditional, granted to those who fit the mold, withheld from those who didn't. The return of the supervisor, accompanied this time by a flight attendant, pulled Thomas from his thoughts. The attendant's expression was apologetic, her steps brisk as she approached. "Admiral Bradley," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The captain would like to speak with you. Please follow me." Thomas straightened slightly, his presence calm but commanding as he nodded. As he walked behind the attendant, he felt the stares intensify, the whispers trailing behind him like faint echoes. He didn't look back. This moment, like so many before it, wasn't about proving himself. It was about reminding others of what they refused to see. The walk to the cockpit was quiet, punctuated only by the muted hum of passengers boarding the plane. Admiral Thomas Bradley followed the flight attendant, her brisk steps a contrast to his deliberate, measured pace. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man accustomed to scrutiny, his gaze steady as he passed row after row of seated passengers. Heads turned as he walked by, some glancing up briefly before returning to their conversations or devices, while others lingered a moment too long. The mix of curiosity and discomfort in their eyes was one he had grown used to over the years. It was the same silent question that followed him into restaurants, elevators, and now, this airplane aisle. Who is he? And why is he here? The flight attendant stopped just outside the cockpit, stepping aside to allow Thomas to pass. Inside, Captain Jonathan Reed stood waiting, his posture upright, his uniform immaculate. At first glance, the captain's expression was one of polite professionalism, the kind reserved for greeting passengers or addressing minor issues. But as his eyes met Thomas's, there was a flicker of recognition, and his demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. "Admiral Bradley," Captain Reed said, stepping forward and extending his hand. His voice carried a tone of respect, firm but unassuming. "It's an honor to have you aboard, sir." Thomas shook the captain's hand, his grip firm but unhurried. "Thank you, Captain," he replied, his tone as steady as his presence. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding my seating." The captain's jaw tightened slightly, his polite expression giving way to something sharper, concern, perhaps even irritation. He glanced toward the flight attendant, who stood quietly nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. "Would you mind explaining the situation to me?" Captain Reed asked, turning to the attendant. She hesitated, her polished professionalism now tinged with unease. "There was an overbooking issue, sir," she began, her words careful. "The Admiral's seat in first class was reassigned due to limited availability." Captain Reed's eyes narrowed slightly, though his tone remained measured. "Limited availability," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "And yet, I see other passengers boarding for first class without issue." The attendant didn't respond immediately, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch, heavy and unspoken. Thomas watched the exchange without interrupting, his expression calm but observant. He had learned long ago that silence could speak volumes, that sometimes the best way to highlight a problem was to let others confront their own discomfort. Finally, the captain turned back to Thomas, his decision made. "Admiral, this is unacceptable. Allow me to personally ensure you're seated in first class where you belong." Thomas inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gesture. "I appreciate that, Captain. Thank you." The captain's gaze lingered on Thomas for a moment longer, as if searching for the right words. Then, with a nod to the flight attendant, he added, "Make the necessary arrangements immediately. This kind of oversight is not how we treat our passengers. Any of them. Let alone someone of Admiral Bradley's distinction." The attendant nodded quickly, her discomfort now fully visible. "Of course, Captain," she said before hurrying back down the aisle. When they were alone, Captain Reed turned to Thomas again, his voice softer now but no less resolute. "Admiral, I want to personally apologize for how this was handled. It shouldn't have happened, and I assure you I'll be addressing this with the airline." Thomas met the captain's gaze evenly, offering a faint smile. "I appreciate your words, Captain, but this isn't just about me. These situations, well, they happen more often than you might think. To people without a title or rank to protect them." The captain's expression shifted, the weight of Thomas's words settling over him. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll do what I can to ensure it doesn't happen again. At least not on my flights." Thomas nodded once, accepting the captain's sincerity. As he turned to leave the cockpit, the faint murmurs of passengers reached his ears again, the whispers carrying the tension of unasked questions. He didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. As he walked back to the first-class cabin, now accompanied by a different flight attendant, he felt the weight of the stars again, heavier now than before. Some passengers averted their eyes as he passed, their discomfort evident in the way they shifted in their seats. Others met his gaze briefly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. When he reached his seat, point 2A, as it had always been, Thomas settled into the plush chair with the practiced ease of a man who had weathered far greater storms. The attendant offered a quiet apology and a drink, which he accepted with a polite nod. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Thomas glanced out the window, the terminal lights blurring into streaks as the aircraft began to move. It wasn't about the seat, he reminded himself again. It was about the subtle patterns, the quiet exclusions that chipped away at dignity in ways loud enough to hurt but too quiet to call out. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his thoughts. This battle, like so many others, wasn't won in a single moment, but it was worth fighting all the same. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm as Admiral Thomas Bradley took his seat in 2A. The same seat he had reserved days before. Around him, the quiet hum of passengers stowing their bags and flipping through in-flight magazines continued. But the atmosphere carried a subtle tension. Thomas could feel it, though no one said a word. Across the aisle, a businessman in a tailored suit glanced his way. The man's expression was hard to read, somewhere between mild curiosity and polite detachment. A few rows behind, a young couple whispered to one another, their eyes darting toward him before quickly turning away. Even the flight attendants, moving briskly through the cabin with practiced efficiency, seemed more cautious now, their smiles brief, their interactions carefully measured. Thomas leaned back in his seat, his face calm, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He had grown accustomed to this kind of attention, the silent calculations people made when confronted with someone who didn't fit their expectations. It wasn't new, it wasn't surprising, but it was always there, a quiet reminder of the barriers that remained. Even in places meant to be neutral. The flight attendant who had initially dismissed him reappeared, her posture a touch more rigid than before. She offered him a drink, sparkling water on a tray, accompanied by an apology so soft it was barely audible. "We're very sorry for the misunderstanding earlier, Admiral," she said, her voice low but steady. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please let us know." Thomas nodded politely, accepting the drink without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," he replied simply, his tone even. He had no interest in making her more uncomfortable than she already was. But neither did he feel compelled to offer reassurance. Some lessons, he had learned, were best left to linger. As the plane taxied to the runway, he glanced out the window, the soft glow of the airport lights reflecting faintly on the glass. The smooth monotony of takeoff offered a moment to collect his thoughts. But his mind kept returning to the same questions. Why had his seat been reassigned? The official explanation was overbooking. But he had seen how other passengers were treated, warmly greeted, their reservations honored without hesitation. He thought of the young attendant's refusal to meet his gaze, The supervisors carefully rehearsed apologies. The way the businessman across the aisle now seemed to watch him with faint curiosity. None of it felt accidental. The reality was one Thomas had faced countless times before. The quiet assumptions, the unspoken doubts, the subtle ways people revealed their biases without even realizing it. To many, he was an anomaly, a black man occupying a space they hadn't expected. A space they might not believe he had earned. It wasn't personal. Not really. That was the insidious nature of it. The flight attendant hadn't acted out of malice, she had simply acted on reflex. Shaped by a society that still struggled to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Thomas turned his gaze from the window, settling into his seat as the plane climbed higher. In the silence of the ascent, he thought about the men and women under his command, sailors from every background, every corner of the country, working side by side toward a common goal. In the Navy, respect was earned through discipline and dedication, through the bonds forged in shared hardship. There, differences in skin color or background mattered less than the integrity of a person's character. But out here, in the world beyond the uniform, those lines weren't so clear. Out here, respect was often given or withheld based on something as arbitrary as appearance. A soft chime signaled the end of the seatbelt requirement, and passengers began to settle in for the flight. The businessman across the aisle pulled out a tablet, his eyes flicking briefly toward Thomas before returning to the screen. The flight attendant reappeared, offering drinks to the other passengers in first class, her tone polite but subdued. Thomas sipped his water, letting the moment pass without comment. He had long since learned that not every battle needed to be fought in words. Sometimes, it was enough to simply be to occupy the space others might think he didn't deserve. To remind them, silently, that he belonged. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The issue wasn't the reassigned seat. It was never about the seat. It was about the assumptions that had led to it. The quiet biases that shaped decisions in ways people rarely acknowledged. He thought of the countless others who faced similar treatment. People without the rank or title to force a reevaluation. People who were dismissed without a second thought. For them, this was more than a single flight. It was a pattern. A persistent reminder of the distance still to be traveled. The flight attendant returned with dinner menus, her hand slightly unsteady as she handed one to Thomas. "Admiral, I hope everything is to your satisfaction," she said softly. Thomas met her gaze for the first time, his expression calm but steady. "It's fine," he said simply. The attendant hesitated, as if searching for something more to say, but then nodded and moved on to the next passenger. Thomas returned his attention to the window, the endless expanse of clouds stretching out below. The stillness of the moment felt heavy, but not unpleasant. It was the kind of silence he had grown familiar with, a silence that carried the weight of unspoken truths and unfinished work. He closed his eyes briefly, the steady hum of the plane fading into the background. This wasn't just about him. He reminded himself again. It never had been. It was about the larger battle. The quiet struggle to be seen and treated as equal. Not for the titles or medals he carried, but for the person he was. As the flight continued, Thomas resolved to carry that fight forward, not in anger, but with the steady, unyielding determination that had always defined him. Sometimes, the most powerful battles were fought not with words, but with quiet persistence. And in that silence, change could take root. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight reached cruising altitude, casting a soft glow over the first-class section. Admiral Thomas Bradley sat quietly in his seat, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. The steady hum of the engines filled the silence, a soothing backdrop to the muted conversations and occasional clinks of glasses. Thomas welcomed the stillness. It gave him space to reflect, to sort through the mix of emotions the day had stirred within him. Outwardly, he remained composed, his expression as calm as ever. But beneath the surface, his thoughts churned, not with anger. That wasn't his way, but with the quiet weight of understanding. The reassigned seat, the dismissive tone of the attendant, the supervisor's deflection. All of it felt so familiar. A story he had lived through in countless variations. It was never overt, never loud. It didn't need to be. The true impact of prejudice often lay in its subtlety, in the quiet ways it seeped into interactions, shaping outcomes before anyone realized it was there. Thomas took a slow sip of water, his gaze shifting to the aisle. The businessman across from him was typing on his tablet, his focus seemingly elsewhere, yet Thomas felt the occasional flicker of his eyes. Brief and tentative, a flight attendant moved through the cabin, her steps careful, her demeanor subdued. The earlier tension lingered, unspoken but present, like a faint static in the air. A young woman seated a few rows ahead leaned over to speak softly to her companion. Her words indistinct but her glance unmistakable. Thomas didn't react. He had long ago learned to let such moments pass, to hold himself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing his own worth. Still, it was hard not to think about what might have happened if he hadn't insisted on speaking with the pilot. Would he have been dismissed as just another passenger? Would the discomfort he now felt have gone unnoticed by those around him? He thought of the men and women he commanded, a diverse group of sailors who relied on one another in ways the civilian world often struggled to emulate. In the Navy, respect wasn't given based on appearances or assumptions. It was earned through action, through commitment, through a shared understanding that everyone's role mattered. But here, in this civilian space, the rules felt different. Respect seemed conditional, handed out sparingly and often withheld without reason. The flight attendant returned, stopping by his seat with another apology in her eyes. "Admiral Bradley," she began, her voice soft. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Thomas looked up at her, his expression neutral but kind. "I'm fine, thank you," he said simply. She hesitated, as if waiting for him to say more, then nodded and moved on. The exchange, though brief, left him thoughtful. He could see the effort she was making, the way she now carried herself with care, as though trying to undo the earlier slight. It wasn't enough to erase the incident, but it was something, a small acknowledgement of the misstep. Thomas turned his gaze back to the window, his reflection faint against the darkened sky. The clouds below stretched endlessly, their soft edges blending into one another. They reminded him of the complexities of the world he lived in, a world where progress and prejudice often existed side by side, where victories were tempered by the knowledge of how much further there was to go. He thought of the countless others who faced similar moments of dismissal, people who lacked the rank or recognition to demand a different outcome. For them, these quiet injustices were not isolated incidents but a part of daily life, woven into the fabric of their existence. Thomas felt the weight of that reality, the quiet responsibility that came with his position. It wasn't enough to push back against prejudice when it affected him personally. His role, as he saw it, was to advocate for others, to use his voice to challenge the assumptions that perpetuated these divides. As the flight continued, he found himself thinking about his next steps. This wasn't the first time he had been confronted with bias, and it wouldn't be the last. But each instance offered an opportunity, a chance to push the needle, even if only slightly, toward a more equitable world. The businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat, glancing toward Thomas once more. This time, their eyes met briefly. The man offered a faint nod, almost imperceptible, before returning to his work. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture, a small acknowledgement of the moment they were both navigating. Thomas returned the nod, then leaned back in his seat, letting his thoughts quiet for a while. The flight attendant passed by again, her expression softening as she caught his eye. As the hours stretched on, Thomas let himself relax, the steady rhythm of the plane lulling him into a reflective calm. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one encounter could change deeply ingrained attitudes, but he held on to the belief that every small step mattered. For now, it was enough to sit in this space, to occupy a seat that was his by right, to remind himself, and perhaps others, that belonging wasn't something to be granted or withheld based on perception. It was a given, a truth as vast and undeniable as the sky beyond the window. The cabin had grown quieter as the flight progressed, the initial bustle of boarding giving way to the subdued rhythm of mid-air stillness. Passengers settled into their routines, reading, napping, or engaging in low conversations. Admiral Thomas Bradley remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside. The serenity of the view belied the subtle tension that still lingered in the air. A tension he knew well. Thomas sipped from the glass of water resting on his tray. His movements slow and deliberate. The silence around him wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried an undercurrent of awareness. He could feel the occasional glances from other passengers, brief and cautious, as if trying to make sense of his presence in first class. Across the aisle, the businessman with the tablet shifted in his seat, his attention flicking toward Thomas before quickly returning to his screen. Thomas didn't react, but the moment settled into his awareness like a pebble dropped into still water. He had learned long ago to read these gestures, the small tells that revealed more than words ever could. What struck him most wasn't the overt discomfort. It was the unspoken weight of assumptions. To the passengers around him, he was an anomaly, a puzzle that didn't fit the neat categories they carried in their minds. They didn't see an admiral. They saw a black man in casual clothes, seated in a space they hadn't expected him to occupy. A flight attendant approached, her steps cautious as she stopped beside his seat. She held a tray with a warm towel and a small plate of mixed nuts. Her expression carefully neutral. "Admiral Bradley," she said softly, "would you care for anything else? Perhaps a refill on your drink?" Thomas looked up at her, his face calm, his tone measured. "No, thank you," he replied. She nodded quickly, lingering for a moment as if expecting him to say more. When he didn't, she moved on, her presence dissipating into the steady rhythm of the cabin. Thomas leaned back in his seat, letting his thoughts drift. Moments like these always left him reflective, not just about his own experiences but about the broader patterns they represented. He thought about how easily bias could slip into the fabric of daily life, unnoticed by those who weren't its targets. To the flight attendant, to the passengers stealing glances, this might have been just another flight. But for Thomas, it was another reminder of the invisible lines that still divided spaces, of how far society had yet to go in unlearning its assumptions. He glanced around the cabin, observing without judgment. A young woman a few rows ahead flipped through a glossy magazine, her focus pointedly elsewhere. The businessman across the aisle tapped on his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. None of them were overtly unkind or hostile, yet the subtle discomfort in their body language spoke volumes. Thomas thought of the sailors under his command, a diverse group brought together by a shared mission. In the Navy, differences were set aside in favor of discipline and unity. Respect wasn't granted based on appearance or assumptions, it was earned through action. It was a standard he had upheld throughout his career, one that shaped every decision he made as a leader. Out here, in civilian life, the rules were different. Respect was often tied to perception, and perception was shaped by bias, sometimes unconscious, sometimes deliberate. The businessman's voice broke the quiet, addressing a flight attendant as she passed. "Excuse me, could I get a coffee? Black?" he asked, his tone clipped but polite. The interaction was mundane, unremarkable, yet Thomas found himself reflecting on it. How often had his own requests been met with hesitation or indifference? Not because of what he said but because of who was saying it. How many others experienced the same? Unable to point to anything concrete but feeling the difference nonetheless? His thoughts were interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The flight attendants will be coming around with refreshments shortly. We expect a smooth journey for the remainder of the flight." Thomas allowed himself a faint smile. Captain Jonathan Reed had handled the earlier situation with professionalism, his swift action a reminder that leadership, when done right, could cut through layers of bias. It wasn't a solution to the deeper problem, but it was a step. The businessman glanced toward him again, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. There was something in the man's expression, curiosity, perhaps, or an attempt to reconcile the figure before him with the assumptions he had carried onto the plane. Thomas returned the look evenly, his face calm, offering no explanation. In that moment, he felt no need to prove himself. His presence was enough. The flight attendant returned with a tray of coffee, offering a cup to Thomas. "Admiral, would you like some coffee?" she asked, her voice more tentative than before. "No, thank you," he said again, his tone polite but firm. As she moved on, Thomas returned his gaze to the window. The clouds below stretching endlessly. He thought about the sailors who had written to him over the years, sharing their struggles and triumphs. Many of their letters echoed the same themes: the quiet battles fought every day, the small victories that came from holding one's ground in the face of doubt. This flight was no different. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was about existing in a space where some believed he didn't belong, and doing so with quiet resolve. As the plane continued its journey, Thomas closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines fill his thoughts. He wasn't naive. He knew these moments wouldn't disappear overnight. But he also knew that each instance, each quiet act of resistance, chipped away at the larger structure of bias. Sometimes, the most profound change began not with words, but with presence. And for now, that was enough. The soft glow of the cabin lights flickered as the flight attendants began their final rounds, collecting trays and tidying up the aisles. Admiral Thomas Bradley sat quietly in his seat, his posture relaxed but his mind active, processing the layers of the day's events. The hum of the engines was steady and unchanging, a rhythm that encouraged reflection. It wasn't about the seat. That much he had reminded himself countless times during the flight. It was about the subtle dismissals, the causal assumptions that said more than words ever could. These moments, though small, carried weight. They were not overt acts of aggression but the quiet echoes of a deeper problem, one that reached far beyond the confines of this airplane. The cabin door to the cockpit opened with a faint click, and Thomas looked up. Captain Jonathan Reed stepped out, his crisp uniform unwrinkled despite the hours in the air. The captain's demeanor was calm but purposeful, his steps measured as he approached Thomas's seat. "Admiral Bradley," Captain Reed said, his voice low but steady. "May I have a moment of your time?" Thomas nodded, gesturing to the seat across the aisle. "Of course, Captain." The captain sat down, folding his hands in his lap. For a moment, neither man spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement of the significance of this moment. "I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier," Captain Reed began, his tone earnest. "The way the situation was handled at the gate was unacceptable, and I've already filed a report with the airline to address it." Thomas regarded him calmly, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your apology, Captain, but this isn't just about me. These situations happen far too often, and not everyone has a title or rank to demand better treatment." The captain nodded, a shadow of regret passing over his face. "You're right," he admitted, "and it's something we need to do better at. Not just as an airline, but as a society. I've seen it myself, though I can't claim to fully understand what it's like." There was a sincerity in the captain's voice that Thomas recognized. It wasn't the polished professionalism of someone trying to save face. It was the quiet honesty of a man who had seen a problem and wanted to do something about it. "In my years of service," Thomas said after a pause, "I've learned that leadership isn't just about making decisions in the moment. It's about setting a standard, showing others what's acceptable and what isn't. What happened today, what happens to so many people, isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of perception." Captain Reed leaned forward slightly, his attention focused. "I couldn't agree more, and I'll make sure today's incident doesn't go unnoticed. The staff will receive additional training, and I'll personally follow up with the gate team." Thomas nodded, appreciating the captain's resolve, but his mind was on the larger picture. "Training is a step," he said, his tone measured. "But real change requires more than that. It requires people to examine their assumptions, to confront the biases they don't even realize they carry." The captain exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "That's harder to fix," he admitted, "but it's not impossible." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the shared understanding between them deepening. In the military, Thomas had often relied on moments like this, moments of quiet but meaningful connection to foster trust and encourage change. "I appreciate your efforts, Captain," Thomas said finally, "and I hope this serves as a reminder that respect shouldn't depend on who someone appears to be. It's something we owe to everyone, without exception." Captain Reed rose from his seat, offering his hand. "Thank you, Admiral. Your words carry weight, and I'll do my part to ensure they're acted upon. Thomas shook his hand firmly, a faint smile touching his lips. That's all I ask. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Thomas leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to the window. The clouds stretched endlessly below, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the challenges it held. The flight attendants passed by again, their smiles a little more genuine now, their movements less stiff. Thomas acknowledged them with polite nods, though he remained deep in thought. Change was never easy, he knew. It came in small steps, in quiet moments like this one, where words planted seeds that might one day grow into something larger. As the plane began its descent, Thomas closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a moment of calm. The battle wasn't over. Not for him, and not for the countless others who faced similar struggles. But for now, he took comfort in the knowledge that his presence, his persistence, had made a difference. Sometimes, progress wasn't about dramatic victories. Sometimes, it was about reminding others of the humanity they so often overlooked. And in that, there was hope. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar rumble of the landing gear breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. Admiral Thomas Bradley opened his eyes as the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the faint hum of voices and rustling belongings signaling the end of the journey. Around him, passengers began to stir, gathering their things with the quiet efficiency of seasoned travelers. Thomas remained seated, his movements unhurried as he reached for his bag. He could feel the subtle tension in the air, the lingering curiosity from those who had watched the events of the flight unfold. It wasn't the kind of tension that made people speak. It was the quieter, more insidious kind, the kind that made them glance and wonder but never confront. The flight attendant approached again, her demeanor softer now, almost tentative. Admiral Bradley, she said quietly, thank you for flying with us. We hope to see you again. Thomas met her gaze, his expression calm but steady. Thank you, he replied, his voice even. He could see the effort in her words, the desire to bridge a gap that shouldn't have existed in the first place. As he stood and stepped into the aisle, he noticed the businessman across from him rising as well. Their eyes met briefly, and the man offered a nod. Not of pity or apology, but of acknowledgement. Thomas returned the gesture, a silent understanding passing between them. The walk through the terminal was like any other. People bustled around him, some with purpose, others aimlessly navigating the maze of gates and shops. Yet for Thomas, this moment felt different. It wasn't the flight itself that lingered in his mind but the layers of meaning hidden within it. The quiet ways people's perceptions shaped their actions. The subtle barriers that still existed despite the progress of time. He passed a family gathered at the arrivals area, their laughter and hugs filling the space with warmth. A young boy in a bright red jacket clung to his father, his face lit with joy. Thomas paused for a moment, watching the scene unfold. It was a reminder, perhaps, of what could be, of the connections that transcended differences, of the humanity that could exist when people chose to see beyond surface appearances. As he made his way toward the exit, the crisp air of the terminal greeted him, a stark contrast to the controlled environment of the plane. The world outside felt bigger, more immediate, yet the same questions followed him, unspoken but ever present. He thought about the captain's apology, about the flight attendant's tentative words, about the businessman's glance. They were small moments, perhaps inconsequential to some, but they carried weight. They were reminders of a larger battle, one that extended far beyond this single flight. For Thomas, this wasn't just about being treated with respect because of his rank or achievements. It was about something deeper. The belief that everyone, regardless of their title or appearance, deserved to be seen for who they truly were. He stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth of the day contrasting with the cool sterility of the terminal. The sounds of the city greeted him: honking horns, distant conversations, the rhythm of life continuing as it always did. As he walked toward his car, he reflected on the journey still ahead. There would be more flights, more moments like these, more instances where the quiet barriers of bias made themselves known. But he carried with him the same resolve that had guided him throughout his career, a determination to confront those barriers. Not with anger but with persistence. with the quiet strength that came from knowing his worth. This wasn't about changing the world in a single moment. It was about planting seeds. About showing others through action. Through presence. That dignity and respect were not optional. Thomas opened the car door, setting his bag on the seat beside him. As the engine hummed to life, he allowed himself a brief smile. The road ahead might be long, but he was ready. He always had been. And as he drove away from the airport, leaving behind the whispers and glances, he carried with him a quiet hope that one day, moments like these would no longer be necessary. That one day, the weight of assumptions would lift, and the world would finally learn to see